Hi, this is NextGen Picks. I was at an electronics store the other day just standing back and watching people stare at the massive wall of TVs, and honestly, it's kind of painful. Everyone is squinting at these blindingly bright demo loops of like slow motion honey pouring over a spoon or a vividly colored parrot trying to figure out if the $700 TV is actually any worse than the $200 one right next to it. But here's the thing, that demo loop is a complete lie. The real frustration doesn't happen in the showroom. It happens 3 months later when you're on your couch, you press the home button on the remote, and it takes 4 full seconds just for Netflix to open because the processor is garbage. Or you're trying to watch a dark, moody sci-fi movie with subtitles, and every time someone speaks, the whole bottom of the screen glows this distracting milky gray. And there's a very specific reason I'm sounding the alarm on this right now. We are currently seeing a massive global spike in memory and SoC component costs. The literal brains of these smart TVs are getting vastly more expensive for manufacturers to buy. If you wait until late 2026 hoping for a magic discount, you're likely going to pay more money for a TV with noticeably worse internal hardware. If you appreciate that we actually buy these displays, set them up in real living rooms, and test the daily frustrations instead of just reading you a spec sheet, hitting subscribe NextGen Picks really helps keep this channel independent. So let's cut through all the dynamic contrast marketing nonsense and focus on what actually matters when you have a hard $1,000 budget ceiling. Because the sub $1,000 TV market is basically a minefield. This is the exact range where manufacturers are forced to make a brutal decision. Do they spend the money on the display panel itself, or do they invest in the processor driving it? And 9 times out of 10, they choose the panel. Because a bright, flashy screen is what grabs your attention when you're walking through Best Buy. You can see the panel, you can't see the processor, you can't see the memory chips, but you absolutely feel them. You feel it when you're trying to jump from your PS5 back to YouTube and the screen hangs on a black loading screen for what feels like forever. Or when you're watching a hockey game, the camera sweeps across the ice and the puck turns into a blurry little comet because the processor can't keep up with the motion fast enough. That's the hidden cost of a cheap TV. And like I mentioned earlier, with global memory prices climbing in early 2026, the components that power a TV's operating system are getting more expensive too. So companies are quietly slipping worse processors into newer models to keep them under that 1,000 psychological barrier. So how do we beat them at their own game? We stop looking at the box and we look at the physics. Let's talk about the Hisense U8 series, specifically the 55-65 in models, which usually float right around that $750 to $950 mark, depending on what random holiday sale is happening this week. On paper, this TV is completely absurd. It is a mini LED panel, boasting over 1,000 local dimming zones and peak brightness levels that cross the 2,000 nit threshold. Actually, let me explain what that really means, because nits is a term that gets thrown around a lot by tech YouTubers, and it kind of loses all meaning. A nit is just a measurement of light. Your standard office monitor is probably around 250 nits. A really good iPad is maybe 600. When I say the Hisense hits 2,000 nits, I don't mean the whole screen is going to burn your retinas like you're staring into the sun. I'm talking about specular highlights. If you're watching a movie in HDR, high dynamic range, and a car explodes at night, or a character shines a flashlight directly into the camera, that specific 10% window of the screen is going to flare up with an intense physical realism that genuinely makes you squint. It's a level of depth that you simply cannot get on a standard edge-lit LED TV. If your living room has giant bay windows or sliding glass doors, and you're trying to watch a Sunday afternoon football game while the sun is basically trying to assassinate your television, the U8 is your weapon of choice. It uses sheer brute force photon emission to overpower ambient room glare. It's a light cannon. But, and this is a massive structural but that you need to be aware of, there is a trade-off. There is always a trade-off. When you cram a backlight system this powerful into a chassis this cheap, you generate heat, a lot of it. If you walk up to a Hisense U8 that's running a 4K HDR movie for 2 hours and put your hand on the back plastic casing right above the input board, it is physically hot to the touch. It's practically a space heater. Now, think about where most people put these. They mount them flush against a wall, sometimes directly over a fireplace, which is terrible for your neck, by the way, but that's a different rant. And they completely choke off the ventilation. The heat isn't going to melt the TV. But over a span of 2 or 3 years, chronic thermal stress slowly bakes the TCL board and the power supply capacitors. This is the exact reason why you see those Amazon reviews where a guy says, loved it for 2 years, then the bottom half of the screen just went black. They didn't get a lemon. They thermally throttled the hardware until it died. If you buy a high-nit mini LED, do not mount it completely flush. Leave an air gap. Use a full motion mount and pull it a few inches off the wall. Just give the poor thing a chance to breathe. The other reality check with the Hisense is the processing. Remember what I said about manufacturers cheaping out on the brain of the TV? Well, the U8 has a decent brain, but it's not a genius. If you feed it a pristine, uncompressed 4K Blu-ray or a high bit rate Apple TV Plus stream, it looks phenomenal. It genuinely rivals TVs that cost twice as much. But what happens if you're watching a heavily compressed YouTube video? Or worse, what if you're watching a local news broadcast through a dusty 1080i cable box from 2014? It looks crunchy. There's really no better word for it. The Hisense processor struggles to clean up low-quality blocky signals. It tries to artificially sharpen the edges of people's faces, and it introduces these weird digital artifacts, almost like a buzzing noise around moving objects. Sony processors are basically magic at fixing garbage signals. Hisense processors just sort of shrug and put the garbage right on the screen. Also, we have to talk about the panel lottery. This is a very real, very frustrating part of buying budget TVs, particularly from brands like Hisense and TCL. Because they are manufacturing these screens at such massive scale to keep the price down, the quality control on the uniformity of the panel itself can be completely hit or miss. You might get a unit with dirty screen effect or DSE. What this looks like in the real world is, imagine a faint grayish smudge or vertical banding that you can't wipe off the glass. You won't notice it when you're watching a dark movie, but the second you watch something with a large uniform block of color, like a panning shot across a bright green golf course or a clear blue sky in a video game, you will see these faint, dirty jail bars staying completely still while the camera moves behind them. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. It will drive you absolutely insane. If you buy this TV immediately the day you get it, pull up a DSE test video on YouTube. It's just a solid gray screen that moves around. If yours looks horribly blotchy, don't try to live with it. Pack it back up and exchange it immediately. You have about a 15 to 20% chance of getting a panel that should have failed QC. That is the hidden tax of an $800 super spec TV. Before we move on to the next one, I want to hear from you guys. Drop a comment down below right now. What is the most infuriating, annoying quirk your current TV does? Does the audio just randomly drop out? Does it refuse to connect to your Wi-Fi until you physically unplug it from the wall? Let me know down there because I read all of these, and honestly, tell me what specific sound bars or media boxes you want us to rip apart on the test bench next month. It helps me figure out what you guys are actually struggling with. Okay, so if the Hisense U8 is the brute force muscle car, what if you don't need blinding brightness? What if you want sheer size, but you refuse to cross that $1,000 line? This is where the math actually starts to make sense in a completely different direction, and we start looking at the TCL QM7 series. Wait, let me frame this right. You can easily find a 65-inch or sometimes even a 75-inch TCL QM7 under $1,000. Think about that for a second. 75 in of mini LED technology for the price of a mid-tier smartphone. It feels like a mistake. It feels like they must have left something critical out of the box to hit that price. And they did kind of, but it's not the hardware, it's the calibration. When you pull a TCL QM7 out of the box, screw the plastic feet into the bottom, and turn it on, the picture is going to look objectively wrong. The color temperature leans aggressively cool. Everything has this slight sterile, bluish hospital light tint to it. And the EOTF tracking, which is essentially the map the TV uses to decide how bright a specific shadow or highlight should be. is intentionally over-brightened. It takes dark, moody scenes and artificially lifts the shadows so everything looks more visible. Why do they do this? Because in a brightly lit showroom, a cooler, brighter image grabs human attention faster. It's biological hacking. But in your living room at 9 p.m., it just looks unnatural. Skin tones look a little sickly, and dark scenes lose all their depth and tension. But here is the secret to the QM7. If you are willing to spend exactly 12 minutes in the settings menu, you can fix almost all of it. You don't need professional calibration tools. You just need to change the picture mode to movie or cinema, drop the color temperature to warm, and dial back the black level slightly. Suddenly, this massive, relatively inexpensive sheet of glass transforms into an incredibly competent home theater display. The local dimming algorithm on the QM7 is surprisingly aggressive. It turns off the backlight zones behind black letterbox bars in movies almost perfectly, so they look completely dark instead of that glowing, distracting gray. It's an amazing value, but you are trading out of the box perfection for sheer real estate. You are the one putting in the final 10% of the work that the factory engineers skipped. But let's talk about what happens in year 2 or year 3 with something like the TCL QM7. The panel itself, the mini LEDs, they will likely be perfectly fine. But the operating system, that's exactly where the budget cuts finally show up. It runs Google TV, which is generally a solid interface, but the MediaTek chip inside the QM7 has very limited onboard memory and processing headroom. After about 6 to 8 months of downloading background updates, caching high-res thumbnails for YouTube, and actively switching between demanding apps, it just starts to choke. You'll hit the home button to back out of a show, and the TV will just sit there staring at you, thinking about it for 3 to 4 seconds. The UI animations will stutter. You literally have to go deep into the system settings, find the storage menu, and manually clear the app. Cache every few months just to get it running smoothly again. It feels exactly like maintaining a cheap Windows laptop from 2012. If you're buying this for an elderly parent who just wants things to work instantly when they press a button, that slight UI friction is going to turn into a daily grinding annoyance. If tweaking menus and clearing memory caches sounds like an absolute nightmare, and you just want the absolute pinnacle of visual contrast physically possible under $1,000, we have to talk about OLED, specifically the LG B4. Now, the B4 is LG's entry-level OLED, and if you time it right, you can usually find the 48 or 55 and hovering right around that $900 to $1,000 mark when it goes on clearance to make room for the new models. And the physics of an OLED are fundamentally different from everything else we've talked about. There is no backlight. Every single one of the 8 million pixels on that screen produces its own light, and more importantly, can turn itself completely off. Wait, let me explain what that actually looks like in a living room, because reading the phrase infinite contrast on a spec sheet doesn't do it justice. When you watch a movie with letterbox black bars at the top and bottom on an OLED in a dark room, the bars don't look dark gray. They physically disappear. You cannot see where the screen ends and the bezel begins. A star field in a sci-fi movie looks like tiny pinpricks of pure light floating in midair. It is stunning, and because there's no liquid crystal layer physically rotating to change colors, the pixel response time is instantaneous, like 0.1 milliseconds. For console gaming on a PS5 or Xbox Series X, the motion clarity is completely flawless. You pan the camera in a first-person shooter, and the background doesn't smear into a blurry mess. But I almost ignored this next part when I first tested OLEDs years ago, and that would have been a massive mistake for anyone buying this for a standard living room. The B4 has a very aggressive auto brightness limiter, or ABL, because OLED pixels are organic compounds that permanently degrade with excessive heat. The TV actively monitors how much of the screen is bright white to protect itself from burn-in. If you are watching a dark, moody scene, a flashlight beam can punch up to maybe 650 nits. It looks great, but if you switch over to a hockey game or a snowy scene in a movie like Fargo, where 80% of the screen is white, the TV goes into a panic and violently throttles the brightness of the entire panel down to around 150 nits. It literally looks like someone walked over to the wall and turned down a dimmer switch on your television. It is incredibly jarring. I noticed something strange here when comparing it to older models too. The B4 is slightly better at hiding that AL transition than the older B2 or B3, but it's absolutely still there. If you have a room with 3 sunny windows, do not buy this TV. You will be squinting at a dark, highly reflective piece of glass all afternoon. Also, we have to talk about burn-in reality. People are terrified of OLED burn-in, and mostly it's overblown. If you watch a variety of movies and shows, you will be fine for years. But if you play the same video game for 4 hours a day every day, that static yellow health bar in the corner of the screen is going to age those specific organic pixels faster than the rest of the screen. Eventually, you will see a faint ghost of that health bar when you're watching the news. It is unavoidable chemistry. You are trading absolute picture perfection for a screen that requires you to be mildly conscious of what you leave paused on it. And there is the physical anxiety of setting this thing up. The top half of the LG B4 is roughly 4mm thick. It is literally a sheet of glass wrapped in a millime of metal. When you take it out of the styrofoam, you are terrified you're going to snap it in half. You have to lay it completely flat on a bed just to screw the stand into the base. It feels wildly fragile. If that level of fragility makes you nervous, or if you refuse to baby your television, this next one is where the debate gets really toxic in the AV community. We have to look at the Sony Bravia X90L. Usually the 55-inch sits right at that $1,000 threshold, and the X90L is the ultimate premium creep television. On paper, it looks like a terrible deal. It is not mini LED. It is a standard full-array LED TV with maybe 60 or 80 local dimming zones compared to the Hisense, which has over $1,000. So why on earth does it cost so much? Because you are paying for the brain. The Sony Cognitive Processor XR is without exaggeration the best piece of silicon in the TV industry right now. And here is why that matters in the real world away from the spec sheets. Most people do not sit around watching pristine, uncompressed 4K Blu-rays all day. We watch compressed YouTube videos. We watch live sports streamed over an app that's compressing the signal to save bandwidth. We watch old brainy episodes of reality TV. When you feed a garbage low bitrate signal into a Hisense or a TCL, those TVs don't really know what to do with the compression artifacts. They just make the blocky, noisy garbage brighter. When you feed that same 720p garbage into the Sony X90L, the XR processor actually analyzes the depth of the image, recognizes what is a human face and what is background noise, and cleans it up in real time. It smooths out the color gradient so you don't get that weird blocky color banding in the sky. It handles motion interpolation without making movies look like a cheap daytime soap opera. Actually, let me explain that better. You know when a football is thrown across the screen and on a cheap TV it looks like it has 3 ghost footballs trailing behind it, or it kind of stutters across the frame? The Sony eliminates that completely. The motion processing is so natural it ruins you for other TVs. But here is the massive trade-off, and I specifically want you to weigh in on this. Because the Sony has so few physical dimming zones, it suffers from blooming. If you watch a movie with subtitles in a dark room, you will see a glowing, cloudy halo of light bleeding into the black bars around the white text. The processor cannot defy physics. If the backlight zone behind the text is 4 in wide, it has to light up the whole 4 in just to show a tiny white word. So, this is the ultimate question, and I want to see the fight in the comments down below. What is worse to you? Do you absolutely hate blooming around bright objects, or do you hate stuttering motion and digital noise? Because under $1,000, you have to choose one. You either buy the better panel with the Hisense, or you buy the better brain with the Sony. Let me know which trade-off you'd rather live with. Now, what if you don't even have $1,000? What if your hard limit is, say, $600 and you're staring at the TCL Q7 or a standard Samsung Edge lit LED at Costco? The TCL Q7 is the ultra-budget anchor right now because it still offers a 120 Hz refresh rate for gaming, which is incredibly rare under $600. But the hidden risk here is something a spec sheet will never explicitly warn you about: off-axis viewing angles. The Q7 uses a VA panel, vertical alignment. VA panels are great for producing deep black levels when you are sitting dead center, but the moment you move off axis, it all falls apart. If you have a wide U-shaped sectional couch and you have friends over for a movie night, the person sitting on the side chair is getting a completely different experience than the person in the middle. At about 20 degrees off C-center, the colors wash out entirely. The contrast drops off a cliff. Skin tones lose their warmth, and everyone on screen looks like they have a mild case of jaundice. It's really bad. If your living room setup requires people to sit at wide angles to the TV, you cannot buy a budget VA panel. You just can't. And then there's the UI hardware friction. This is the stuff that drives long-term owners crazy, and it's heavily prevalent in the sub-$500 tier. With these budget sets, the HDMI ERC handshake is notoriously unstable. ERC is the port you plug your soundbar into, so the TV remote can seamlessly control the volume. On high-end TVs, it works perfectly. On a budget TCL or a lower-end Vizio, it's a dice roll. Every single morning you turn the TV on, the picture comes up, but there's no sound. The TV firmware literally failed to send the wake-up signal to the soundbar. So, you sit there aggressively mashing the volume button up and down in absolute silence, trying to force it to connect. Finally, you just sigh, unplug the TV from the wall, wait 10 seconds, and plug it back in to force a hard reboot of the internal logic board. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a massive documented structural failure in how cheap SoCs handle HDMI CEC protocols. You are saving $400 upfront, but you are paying for it in daily low-level annoyance for the next 5 years. So how do we actually synthesize all this? How do you avoid making a massive 1,000 mistake? You stop looking at the spec sheets and you look at the physical reality of your living room. If your TV is going into a room with massive bay windows, skylights, or you aggressively watch Sunday afternoon sports with all the blinds open, do not buy the LG OLED. I don't care how many Reddit purists yell at you about infinite contrast. You will literally be staring at a dark, expensive mirror, watching your own reflection on the glass. You need the Hisense U8 OLED. It is a brute force light cannon that will violently punch through afternoon glare. Just please remember the thermal issue. Pull it a few inches off the wall on a full motion mount so you don't bake the internal power supply by year 3. Actually, wait. If you are on a strict budget, let's say $750 is your absolute hard ceiling, and you just want the biggest, most cinematic screen possible, the TCL QM7 is the undeniable best value. Yes, the out-of-the-box color temperature is aggressively sterile and blue. Yes, the built-in Google TV interface will absolutely start stuttering and dropping frames after 8 months of app updates. But here is the ultimate insider hack. Buy the TCL, spend 10 minutes warming up the color in the settings, and then immediately plug in a dedicated Apple TV 4K or a high-end Roku. You completely bypass that cheap internal MediaTek processor, and suddenly that budget TCL acts like a $2,000 flagship monitor. It's the smartest money you can spend. But if we're talking about the absolute best overall TV right at that $1,000 threshold, it's a split decision. If you're building a dark basement home theater or putting this in a dim bedroom, it's the LG B4 OLED. The perfect black levels and the zero lag gaming response are physically impossible to replicate on a standard LED. You're buying pure, uncompromised picture depth. But for the vast majority of you, the people putting this in a normal mixed light living room, watching highly compressed YouTube videos, streaming live sports, and dealing with everyday UI friction. The best overall is the Sony Bravia X90L. I know it has fewer local dimming zones than the Hisense. I know you will see a little bit of blooming around white subtitles, but the Sony XR processor is the only brain in this price bracket that actively cleans up the blocky, noisy garbage of modern streaming compression without making the image look artificial. It doesn't drop the EER soundbar connection, it just works smoothly day after day. Hi, me again. Look, here's the final truth bomb. The television industry plays very dirty with model numbers. A manufacturer will release a fantastic TV one year and then the next year they will keep the exact same name but quietly downgrade the internal memory or swap out the processor because global component costs spiked. And like we talked about earlier, memory prices for these smart OS boards are surging right now in early 2026. The incoming models are going to be a minefield of hidden downgrades, just so these brands can maintain their profit margins under $1,000. If you are buying one of these, do not just search the brand name on Amazon and click the first sponsored result. They constantly mix up the good models with the cheaper gutted revisions from last year. Down in the description, I've put together a list of vetted links to the exact safe versions of the models we tested today. These are the specific SKUs that avoid the revision traps and have the actual verified hardware we just talked about. Use those to check the current pricing, see if the clearance drops have hit yet, and protect your wallet from the bait and switch. Let me know in the comments which trade-off you decided to live with, the blooming or the glare.